Okay, so now we're going to start proteins. This is our third biological macromolecules. We cover carbohydrates and lipids. At this point, now we're talking about proteins. Other than protein, water, proteins are the most abundant type of molecule in the body. Okay, all it's the proteins really are really important. They're probably not that any other molecules aren't important, but just because proteins have so many different jobs to do. They're the workers, they're the structures, they're the just about everything that's done needs to get done or made or built in a cell is a protein. Okay, and so there's thousands of different types of proteins, and there's thousands of those thousands of types. And each type of protein has a unique job, and that's one of the things we're going to see about this section is that proteins, there are proteins that have unique functions, and then what we're going to do is try to figure out a little bit the relationship between structure and function. So if we know the structure of a protein, we can actually figure out what its job is, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. The thing about proteins that's different than we talked before is that the carbohydrates and lipids were mostly made of carbons, hydrogens, oxygens. For proteins, what we're going to do is add nitrogen, and sometimes you'll notice sulfur. Okay, so proteins have carbon, oxygens, hydrogens, and nitrogens, and sometimes sulfur. Really, the big deal here is adding a nitrogen, which we just talked about in the last slideshow with amines. We'll see that basically proteins are made of. Okay, proteins, a lot of times when people think about proteins, they think they have a very narrow job to do. Like people think about hamburger or food or diet, okay, or even maybe like hair. Okay, and usually in my classes we talk about that, and it's always surprising how little people know about proteins and how little people understand what they do. And so what I've written down here is some of the jobs they do, and I'm probably missing them, but I would like you to know these in terms of what they do. So one of the things that proteins do, and we saw this in the last test, there's lipoproteins, which are carrier proteins. So there's a type of proteins that will carry things around in the body, like lipoproteins and hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carries oxygen to your cells. We talked about last test, we talked about cell membranes, active and facilitated transport. And the channels were proteins. Okay, movement. How we're able to move, how cells are moved. Well, we have muscles, they're made out of proteins. And that's what most people think of proteins when they think about proteins. They think about muscle, but that's just a type of protein. Cells move around through flagella, little whippy actions, and cilia, like little hair type structures that are on the cell that will move things around. Okay, another place are antibodies, not antibiotics, but antibodies. And we have these in our bodies, and what they do is that if there's a foreign protein, like a virus, okay, a virus is made out of the shell of a virus is made out of protein. And when the antibody sees a foreign protein, like the code of a virus, it will try to attack it and get rid of it. Okay, structure. Some proteins are involved with structure, like connective tissue, which you'll learn about AMP. You have your hair, and inside the cell, inside cells, there's also structure that, like the cellular skeleton type structures. that are made of proteins as well. A lot of proteins are hormones. We learned in the last chapter, we talked about steroid hormones, but there's a whole other class of hormones that are not steroid. And these actually, there's more of these guys than there are steroids. There's like insulin, thyroid stimulating hormone, pituitary stimulating hormones. All those, I think they're endocrine hormones. Those are mostly proteins. And what a hormone really is, it's a signal that's related from one part of the body to another part of the body that something's going on. Okay, they can be cellular receptors. Okay, we saw that in the last chapter when we looked at the mosaic model. There are proteins embedded in the cell walls, cell membrane, which molecules can attach to, that can cause changes in the cell and its behavior. And enzymes are proteins that will do chemistry. That is, they will take a reactant and to help it turn into a product. And we will be spending really the majority of our time talking about function of proteins, talking about enzymes. The rest of these guys up here, we really won't be talking about how they work a whole lot. But we will be spending time talking about enzymes and how they work. And last, okay, we do eat protein, and that's basically because proteins are breaking it down all the time. So what we need to do is remake them. And so to remake them, we have to eat protein, and the protein that we eat helps remake the broken down proteins. Also, we get a little bit of energy from proteins, but our primary energy source is either from carbohydrates or fats. So know these guys here. I believe there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them. Okay, because this really tells us what proteins are. And when you hear the word protein after this class, hopefully you'll think of something bigger than just hamburger and muscle. Okay, proteins are chains of amino acids connected by peptide bonds, and we'll be spending time about that on this thing called chains of amino acids. But this is kind of what it looks like. We have each one of these little circles. Here's an amino acids, and there's links between each circle. That's called a peptide bond. And when the cell makes it, it's going to look something like this, and then eventually what it's going to do is it's going to fold up, and it doesn't get all extended like this. It's going to be all folded up into a very neat looking shape for it to do its job. Okay, excuse me for my little bit of hacking here. My throat's a little stuffy. I don't have the virus. It just gets a little stuffy sometimes. Okay, let's go on. Oh yeah, so there's these things called amino acids, and we're going to spend more time about them. And there's 20 of them, and here's a list of them. And we'll spend more time talking about these 20. Okay. All right. So let's go over the basic structure of an amino acid. An amino acid actually has 3 parts to it. Okay. The first part is an amine. Well, notice the total structure here. Okay. So there's one part here, another part here, another part here. Okay. The first part is an amine. And remember, amine is with a nitrogen attached to a carbon. And then we have a carboxylic acid that we talked about with lipids. And then we have this thing called an R chain. Okay. What we're going to see is that all amino acids will have this part in common, the amine and carboxylic acid. But what will be different between the 20 amino acids will be this R group up here. And we're going to spend, that's what we're going to be identifying and looking at now. All right, so here's a list of the 20 amino acids. And if I was willing to torture you, I wanted to torture you, I'd have you memorize them all. But I won't. I put over here a little bit of information that we're going to talk about now. You'll see hydrophobic, acid, positive, and so we're actually going to, you're not going to have to know each amino acid, but you're going to have to know these classifications, which we're going to be talking about. Well, after we talk about this. Okay, some nutritional aspects of proteins. Okay. So we need to eat proteins, and the reason why we eat proteins is because they have amino acids. And the amino acids will help replenish the amino acids that get broken down, the proteins that get broken down in our body. And we need to make new proteins, so we need amino acids. A lot of the amino acids that we need for proteins, our body can make them already. So those are called non-essential amino acids. Okay, essential amino acids are amino acids that our bodies don't make. And so what we need to do is we need to have them in our diet. And here's a list of them. So there's 10 of them, but really for adults there's only 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now these 8 are actually pretty interesting, in which we're going to see in a few minutes. We're going to, for instance, isoleucine, leucine, methionine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and valine. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the 8 that we need to get in our diet are hydrophobic or nonpolar, which is interesting. While only 2 of them, the lysine and threonine, are polar. And I just skipped over that slide because actually it can be related to later, but we'll just skip over it for now, and we'll go continue with our nutritional basis of proteins. So some proteins will have all the essential amino acids, have all 8 or 10 of them in them, and those would be like animal proteins, like eggs and meat and so forth. An incomplete protein food is a food that is low or lacking in one or more of the essential amino acids. And actually a lot of plant proteins are incomplete. And so here's a list. You'll notice is that egg, milk, meat, fish, poultry, all from animal sources, and none of the essential amino acids are missing. Well, these guys here are all plant-based, and you'll see that they are missing one or some more of the essential amino acids. So if you were to eat nothing but corn, you would not get lysine and tryptophan in your diet. So what you would have to do is you would have to eat something else, maybe like peas, corn and peas. And if you ate corn and peas together, you would get a complete set of essential amino acids. Okay, you don't need to memorize these. All right, and you won't have to memorize what we're going to go over now. I'll just tell you what you're going to have to know in terms of, what you're going to have to know. All right, so. Okay, so there's going to be basically 4 types of amino acids. There's nonpolar, polar, acid-base, and special. And we're going to go over nonpolar first, then polar, acid base, and then special. All right. Now you won't. So what we have here are the nonpolar amino acids. And from the last chapter, one way you can tell if you have a nonpolar substance or hydrophobic is it has a lot of carbon. So what we're going to do is focus on this part up here, the yellowish part. The blue part is common between all amino acids. The yellow part, the side chain, is what's different. Now if you look at all of these guys, they have lots of carbons in them. Glycine has a hydrogen, but we consider that nonpolar as well. But you notice is that none of these have oxygens or oxygens in them. And that's one way you can tell if they're nonpolar, if there's a lot of carbons or absence of oxygens. So these have lots of carbons in their side chains. If you were to look at a protein and counted all the amino acids inside a protein, about 60% of them would be nonpolar. So a protein is more nonpolar than it is polar. It's hydrophobic because we said is hydrophobic. It's another word for nonpolar. And these guys are, the side chains are big. So that means they have large surface areas, which means they can have good London dispersion forces. And because they're hydrophobic, we can think oily. That means they're going to kind of want to get away from water and get stuck together. And that's going to be a key point. Okay, polar amino acids. Polar amino acids will have oxygens in their side chains. Every one of these has oxygen in their side chains. Okay, there's 5 of these. There were 9 of the nonpolar. There's 5 of the polar. If you were to look at 100, if there was 100 amino acid protein, approximately 35 of those amino acids would be polar. Again, they're hydrophilic. Remember, hydrophilic likes water. And then this means they're going to be sort of looking for water when you put them in water, while the nonpolar guys will be kind of pushed away from water. Okay, there's another type of amino acids called acids and bases. These, there's 4, there's 2 of each type, and they really don't take up, there's not a lot of these found in proteins. They have specific jobs, that's why there's not many of them. They form connections between each other often. We call that a salt link. So if you see an acid in a protein, you'll often have a base right next to it, forming a salt link. These are hydrophilic as well, so you usually find them on the outside. We'll see in proteins, again facing water. And then lastly, there's these 2 special amino acids, cysteine and histidine. And there's just 2 of them, and they only make about between 1 to 2 or 3% of all proteins. And that's because they have very specific jobs. And one of the things that cysteine does is it helps hold together proteins. And it acts as locks. It kind of locks a protein into its shape. Histidine is often found in the place where the work of the protein where the job of a protein is done. Maybe like the active site, which we're going to talk about when we get to enzymes. Okay, in terms of their popularity and population in terms of in a protein, most of a protein is nonpolar, and then it goes polar, acid base, and special. Now the reason why the amino acids, why proteins are mostly nonpolar, is because the nonpolar part actually helps create the structure. Alright, so most of the nonpolar amino acids are involved in forming the structure of a protein. And these guys down here are mostly involved with the function. So I have this little rainbow here that just shows is that the guys at the top are mostly involved with structure, the guys on the bottom mostly with function, but sometimes there's non-polar guys that can be functional, and there can be special guys that are involved with structure. And we'll talk about the inside and outside when we talk about protein structure, which will be in the next slideshow.